So continuing on here with language, Rousseau says many of our ideas, and I already indicated this to you in the previous lecture, come through language. They're mediated by language. They're not things that are just based fundamentally only on sensation, right? Sense perception. Again, Descartes and Rousseau both have a broad idea of sense perception where the way something tastes is an idea, but Rousseau says most of our ideas actually aren't like this. And he's, of course, talking about humans here, not just animals, right? Most of our ideas are linguistically mediated. Why then, he next asks, was language ever necessary in the first place? He says, isn't it true that if we weren't talking in the beginning, in the so-called state of nature, that there wouldn't have then been any need to talk, right? Why did we eventually come to do this thing that we weren't doing in the beginning? Rousseau says, language actually emerged in a domestic context, but not in the nice little family unit that other philosophers have presupposed. Right? Rousseau says, instead of being a little family unit, it was instead just the domestic relation between the mother and the child. This is what first gave rise to language for the first time. And Rousseau notes that the child probably had more to say than the mother. He says, for the most part, most of what the child would have said would have been unique also. It would have been individualistic, just something made up on the spot, something that maybe the mother didn't even know specifically what was meant, but she was able to have a general idea, right? She was able to interpret it in a way where she was able to respond to the child with whatever the child needed. So the question then is, if these first sorts of language were unique individual productions, how did this ever stick, right? How did we take all of these countless private productions and eventually come up with something like language, which is a system, right? I mean, any private language that you have isn't much of a language at all, outside of the confines of computer science or something, if you're not able to use this language with someone else who also understands, right? So the point here is that isn't it true that a language has to be built out of words that aren't just unique, right? It has to be comprised of shared meanings in order to be effective. So how did language get as common as today it is? So Rousseau continues, he says, if this is how language could have first came up, right, how then, we should ask, was it firmly established? And he's going to ultimately say that he can't solve this problem. He can't come up with a good answer to this question, right? He says that figuring out how language was established on a wide scale is actually a lot harder than figuring out how it may have first appeared in small primitive forms, like a baby crying to her mother. Rousseau adds on page 30, if it was true that men needed speech in order to learn to think, they needed even more to know how to think in order to discover the art of speech. So this is kind of a little catch-22, right? It almost borders on something like a paradox, right? The problem here is if we needed to know how to speak in order to think for the first time, right? Isn't it true at the very same time that in order to talk, we needed to know how to think, right? It's really difficult to make any sense of that, to figure out which came first, so to speak. It seems like both of them had to be there at the very beginning. But Rousseau continues to elaborate, and he adds this first language, right, we could call the cry. And here we don't even just mean the cry of a baby to her mother, but also the cry of men and women, right? Rousseau says this cry was universal, but it wasn't nuanced enough for ordinary life, right? It wasn't something complex enough to give a speech before a giant crowd of people and have people who understood you, right? You would just be shouting, screaming. So what he has in mind, of course, is imagine someone in your little village in the state of nature. And of course, here we're at the point before there was even such a thing as a village in the first place. But imagine someone wanders off from the group and you hear this person screaming, and then a few seconds later you see this person come running towards you, and this person keeps screaming, and everyone would know, gosh, we should probably run the direction this person is running. There's some sort of predator or monster after this person, so we better act correctly, otherwise we're going to end up eaten. Right? So these first words, these first cries, Rousseau says, they were far broader in meaning. They were just incredibly wide in their signification, because at first every word stood for a whole proposition. You didn't have a word that really stood on its own and needed other words in order to make something like a full sentence. You instead had just one word that stood for the whole sentence already. So to follow the example that I already gave you, right? So a person cries out just this simple little scream, and everyone else would know that scream means big predator coming this way. And we could even add, we all better run with that person, right? It stood for all of that. So if we're talking about language like this and thought like this, we find that it's very different from the sort of thinking that we did when we worked through something like Plato, or when you are thinking in a history class, right? Meaning, there's a big difference between these sorts of things and abstract thinking. Rousseau says abstract thinking, like what we would do in a philosophy classroom, it's painful. It's not very natural. It's something that didn't define us in the very beginning, right? Where even our first types of language were not abstract. They weren't capable of grasping with things like beauty or justice. So Rousseau continues, and he says the first words were particular. They were very specific at one and the same time, that they were universal in the sense that everyone was able to infer a whole proposition from the word, right? At the same time, this word or this cry that you would have uttered would have been right, very, very sort of specific in what it stood for. You couldn't, again, have anything like an abstract discussion, because you didn't have any sort of reference, right, or network between all of these little words, right? They didn't necessarily mean what they meant in virtue of being different from some other word. So just concretely, it's not the case that in meant what it meant in contrast to this other word out, which means the opposite, right? We didn't really have a system like this in the beginning. Everything stood on its own in its particularity. For this reason, right, Rousseau says the more limited knowledge was, right, and it's most limited in the beginning, in this hypothetical state of nature, the bigger was the dictionary, right? Because the dictionary would have been composed of just more and more particular words, right? You wouldn't have had, as I said, shared references and shared meanings, which would have been required as knowledge became more complex. So we're going to say that we can only have a general idea with a word, and we can only understand these ideas with propositions. This is probably why animals would lack ideas of a certain sort, right? So we talked about animals having sense ideas, but Rousseau is going to indicate that this is the difference when it comes to different types of ideas. And he asks, which was the more necessary? Again, this will remind you from the question we had at the end of the previous slide. It's another sort of paradox, catch-22 type inquiry. This is, which was the more necessary? A society that was already established to invent language, or a language that was already invented in a manner that was well suited for establishing society, right? Again, it seems like both of them would have required the other. It seems like in order to invent language, we would already need society. At the same time, it seems like in order to invent society, we would have needed language, right? They both seem like right there at the beginning, they must have been necessary, but we can't really navigate this question. We can't figure out what the answer is to it. So what is Rousseau's real point here? I know it's easy to kind of lose focus when we get into these discussions on language. They can kind of result in your eyes rolling into the back of your head, because it's so hard, of course, to step outside of language, as sophisticated as we are today, as reliant as we are on words and sentences. Well, with Rousseau's argument here, the idea is that it's almost impossible to really rigorously and definitively figure out how language was created. It's mysterious. It's kind of paradoxical if you look at certain aspects of it. It's almost, we could say, like language must have been created with the help of gods, right? And I'm sure you've seen before various conspiracy theories that argue along these lines and say that it's just impossible. We could have came up with language on our own. It must have been, given to us by gods or given to us by aliens, is the currently popular version of these conspiracy theories, right? But the reason why we have these theories, right, is that we can't figure out the answer, right? That's why you have these alternative explanations with their outlandish, far-fetched accounts for how these things came about, right? It's really pretty obvious that we can't totally figure out completely and with 100% certainty how language arose. But Rousseau's point, right, isn't just it's hard to figure out how language got so popular and really stuck and was something that kind of would come to define us across the board, right? The idea, rather, is that if it's true in the state of nature that we had no language, then language is not natural. Language isn't given to us by nature. I mean, that's practically a platitude, right? Which is a fancy word for, just a sentence that is like obvious the very way that it's written, right? If in the state of nature we didn't have language, then language isn't given to us by nature. It's a tautology, right? Nature, in other words, didn't prepare us to be social, Rousseau concludes from this. That's a big inference that he makes. If we didn't have language from nature, and if we didn't have society and social interaction, and if social interaction would have required language, then it's obvious, Rousseau thinks, that nature didn't want to set up bonds between people. Nature didn't want us to be social, otherwise it would have prepared us for it. So when people say that the state of nature is miserable, Rousseau says, when someone like Hobbs, for example, talks about how just truly awful it was, Rousseau says that actually doesn't mean a whole lot, does it? Because these people wouldn't have had any conception, any understanding of this word misery. They wouldn't have known this concept. They wouldn't have even identified their situation as one which would have been miserable. To us in the present, looking back upon the past, we might be tempted to call the situation miserable, but they wouldn't have even had this realization, nor could they. And Rousseau says, actually, if you think about it, this is on 34, nothing could be as miserable as one of these savages dazzled by enlightenment, right? Tormented by passions and desires, and reasoning about a state different from his own. So Rousseau is saying to this person in the state of nature, if he was capable of seeing the future and looking at us today, he would say that we're the miserable ones, right? We're the ones who are worse off due to our situation. And Rousseau adds one more important line here, same page. He says, in instinct alone, we had all we needed for living in the state of nature. In this later stage, cultivated reason, right? We have what is necessary only for living in society. So again, we have something that we kind of don't need. We have this supplementary reason, right, that we continue to develop and enhance and work on, but it doesn't really give us anything that we need. It gives us something that is just totally superfluous. But there's one thing we want to stop and realize here to the side, and that is that if in the state of nature there was no language, no concepts, then some interesting conclusions should follow from this. There's interesting implications, I should say. One, there was neither good nor evil in the state of nature. We wouldn't have had any linguistic apparatus with which to draw the abstract lines of thought. We would have never came up with these ideas, Rousseau says. If we didn't have good or evil, we also didn't have vice or virtue, right? If you want to talk about physical vices, things like eating too much or being, overly immobile and not getting up and moving your body or something. Sure, there were vices of this sort, vices which hurt our health, but as for things like dishonesty or whatever, committing violence or something like this, right? We wouldn't have considered these things vices. We wouldn't have called them bad. We just wouldn't have had the terms to even make these moves. So Rousseau actually returns again to Hobbes, his contemporary, in a more sustained sort of attack on Hobbes, adding a few more points about how the two differ in their philosophy. He says, the problem with Hobbes is the human isn't naturally evil just because she has no idea of goodness, right? I mean, I did just say this as Rousseau, right? That this person didn't have an idea of good or evil. But I don't want to go so far as to say that this person, therefore, was naturally evil, right? Rousseau also says that I wouldn't want to say this person is vicious just because she didn't have knowledge of virtue. So Hobbes is someone who criticized what some philosophers called natural right, right? Rousseau, less so. For Rousseau, it's the state of nature where our care for our own preservation was least prejudicial to that of other people. It was the most conducive to peace, meaning the best set up for a state of peace, and it was the most suited to mankind overall. Right? And again, Hobbes thought precisely the opposite of this, and the issue comes down to, right, the conclusions that he draws from the lack of familiarity that this person would have had with virtue and goodness and these sorts of things. But Rousseau defends here natural right. Rousseau adds man is weak when he's dependent and is set free before he is robust. That's on 36. So our weakness came later, when we were dependent upon one another, when we were dependent upon society and community. But we find that in the beginning it wasn't this way, right? We were much stronger, and in our strength we were radically free to do whatever we willed. So he says, and again, this flies in the face of Hobbes's line of thought, he says, these savages weren't wicked precisely because they didn't know what it is to be good. So Hobbes also, according to Rousseau, failed to notice how compassionate we were in the state of nature, right? As I said, we cared for our own preservation in a way that, despite how radically free we were, didn't really require us to hurt other people, right? In fact, caring for ourselves was the best thing we could have hoped for when it came to a state of peace for everyone. And it worked the best for all of us, he says, right? So we had this natural sort of compassion that defined us. We wouldn't have had the term for it, but it's the way we behaved. And Rousseau will deliver some pretty damning remarks of philosophy itself. He says it's also philosophy that isolated us. Philosophy that told us with our abstract thinking to say, right, to ourselves privately when we saw someone else suffering, perish if you will, I am safe, right? This different sort of self-preservation, which definitely was prejudicial to other people, which said caring for yourself is the most important thing. You don't need to worry about someone else who might need your help. You need to be first and foremost worried about keeping your own self safe, preserving yourself. Don't worry about the rest. But this philosophy which came later, Rousseau says, again, wasn't something that we would have known in the beginning. In the beginning, we knew pity, and pity helped us preserve the species overall. Again, we wouldn't have had a word for it, right? But it was something that we just went with. And in the state of nature, this pity took the place of all sorts of rules and laws and codes and morals and virtues. It was just completely natural. It was instinctual. I have here that it couldn't be disobeyed. Technically, of course, it could, because we had free will, unlike animals. But none of us actually made this choice, Rousseau says. We all went the route where we pitied one another. We did good for ourselves with as little possible harm to other people. And it's this natural feeling that we have towards seeing someone else suffer, to seeing someone else be harmed, that actually accounts for today our aversion to evil. Rousseau says it's in fact this natural sort of programming that we have to not like to see other people in these positions, in a state like this, that actually is the basis for today what we call our, avoidance of evil. It's the real reason. In other words, he's saying that we look down upon evil. And he says reason alone, philosophy alone, we could say, never on its own could have preserved us. As great as it may have been, right? The power of the intellect, all the great things that resulted from it, all of the inventions and so on. If we only had reason, then we never would have been able to survive as humanity. So again, it's something other than reason, this natural pity that helped preserve us. But Rousseau will entertain an objection here, something that he realizes someone might say is a problem with his argument, and that is, aren't these rules and laws that came later necessary, right? You're making it sound very utopic, very ideal. I told you Rousseau does have an idealized conception of the state of nature, right? Is he being overly optimistic here? He thinks that certain bad things didn't happen. Specifically, Rousseau asks, someone might say, wouldn't they, that laws perhaps are necessary in order to hold back the wild passions, right? To hold back wild and intense behavior, desires that some people might have to rape one another, something like this, right? This could be a problem even if the human is, in the state of nature, compassionate, right? Maybe we really do feel pity, but maybe at the same time we experience these wild urges that laws can help control and reduce the frequency of. Rousseau says, actually the law still isn't necessary, even in situations like this. He says, really what the law does is it makes the problem worse. It tempts people. He says the law doesn't stop anyone from doing the behavior that's illegal. In fact, maybe it is what makes someone in the first place want to do this thing. And of course you can sort of look up examples of this in the United States, and how even some states, for example, that have legalized the recreational usage of marijuana, people thought that this would result in more teenagers getting their hands on it and smoking. And in at least a few cases, they found that the opposite has occurred, because no longer do you have this taboo. You also find this with comparisons between the United States and much of Europe when it comes to the minimum age for consuming alcohol, right? There's, some of you have probably been over to Europe, a very different attitude over there when it comes to at what age it's okay to have a glass of red wine or a beer with dinner or something. And you find that in the United States, where the age is higher at 21 compared to some of these countries like Portugal and Spain and Italy and so on, that you have far more of these people at a young age abusing alcohol, right? It just doesn't always happen this way in Europe, where the age is younger. So you have to ask, is it that high age that compels some people to abuse, right? To start drinking too young, or those people who do wait until they're 21 in the United States, maybe the first time after their birthday they drink, they just entirely overdo it, and they wind up in the hospital or something. These things do occur. You have to ask yourself, would it occur if we had a more reduced age, right, at which you could first have these things? It would be something you are used to. It wouldn't be this spectacular occasion where you felt like you had to overdo it. So what we see here, though, in Rousseau is a distinction between moral and physical sides of love, right? Moral and physical dimension of love. And he's relating this to this wild, passionate urges to rape that maybe laws would do a good job of making people avoid. Now, basically, the moral aspect of love, Rousseau says, or the moral dimension, is where you would focus on a particular object. right? So having one specific boyfriend or girlfriend, husband, wife, partner, spouse, what have you, right? Rousseau says this is a moral dimension of love that actually is artificial. It's not something we were naturally programmed for. And implicitly, right, the point here he's making is that we, in the present, view these wild, passionate behaviors as wrong because we presuppose this idea of a particular object. I do think he's wrong about this. I think that there are other reasons in virtue of which we have this aversion to these crimes. But let's follow Rousseau here. He says that this moral aspect of love was not natural and was actually cultivated by women with much skill and care in order to establish empire over men. And what women were trying to do here, Rousseau says, and again, this is just outrageously sexist, he says, is these women were trying to make dominant the sex that ought to obey, right? Meaning they were trying to make themselves the people who controlled and led society, when really, right, sort of in parentheses, he's saying, as everyone knows, they're the ones who should be obeying men. So he's here also sort of, and even today we find this sort of thing from men, right, who, explain away, instances of rape and these sort of violent domestic crimes in a way that's rather tone deaf, right? They don't really know how they sound when they say these sorts of things, almost explaining or justifying the frequency of these horrible situations. So Rousseau says that these savages, again, this racist term, are without a conception of love like the kind that we have today, right? This particular object being in a relationship with someone. And we want to ask ourselves, why does Rousseau think this? How do we know that? Well, for Rousseau, he says that this person in the state of nature had a mind that wouldn't have been able, as we've already said, to form abstract ideas, including ideas like that of regularity and proportion. And because he wasn't able to have this idea in his mind, Rousseau says his heart wouldn't have been capable of feeling the sentiments of love and admiration that, even if only unconsciously, arise from the application of these ideas. So in short, it would have just been impossible for this person to have an idea of a relationship with some one person throughout time. Rousseau says these savages, they just went with nature's direction. He says for them, every woman was good, right? They had pity, right? So there were good parts, but here's something that actually, sounds far from good. Kind of, sounds like a hippie commune or something, a bit as well, where everyone was just able to freely interact with and hook up with, so to speak, physically, whoever they wanted. So isn't it possible that this is all incorrect? Rousseau seems pretty sure of what he's saying here, but there's no way we can know all of these things without having any real solid science when it comes to the psychology of early humans when it came to these sorts of things. At least in a straightforward sense, we can make certain inferences from the size of certain parts of their brains and so on. But it's scientifically kind of tenuous and speculative. Rousseau's also going to imply that these people in the state of nature lacked imagination. I don't think he's quite right here either, right? Let's go ahead and grant that this early person has no ideas about things like math and philosophy or whatever. Philosophers often do over-rationalize the imagination. But would we want to say that this person wasn't able to just lay on his or her back or lie on his or her back and look at the sky and the clouds and not see certain images in the clouds, right? The sort of stereotypical childhood exercise of the imagination. I would think that it wouldn't require too many abstract ideas in order to make that association. I could be wrong, but I think Rousseau here goes a bit far when he says that this person would have lacked imagination. It may have been a different sort of imagination than the type we experience, but lacking it altogether just seems a bit hasty. So Rousseau kind of has accused other philosophers of over-rationalizing the state of nature, depicting the person in the state of nature as like a philosopher or this sort of primitive genius. But he kind of here is doing the same thing in his over-rationalization of the imagination. I just don't know that it requires as much complex thinking as he seems to presuppose to be the case. So Rousseau entertains the objection that animals will fight over females, but he will dismiss this objection because, in short, he says we're not the same as these animals. It's not a worthwhile or a significant comparison to make, so it doesn't really give us too much we can conclude. We have a really important line on 41. Rousseau says, "The savage man, wandering in the forests, without work, without speech, without a home, without war, and without relationships. He was equally without any need of his fellow man, and without any desire to hurt his fellow man. Perhaps he didn't even recognize any of these people individually. Being subject to so few passions, and being on his own sufficient, not needing anyone, he only had such feelings and such knowledge that would suit his condition. He felt only what he truly needed to feel. He saw only what he believed it was necessary to see, and his intelligence made no more progress than his vanity." So most of this is relatively straightforward, but this last line here, where his intelligence made no more progress than his vanity, we ask ourselves, what does this mean? Well, Rousseau is saying that this person in the state of nature was in this state where he lacked the sort of intelligence that we take for granted today, and sometimes they're bad about assuming to be the only type of intelligence. And this person's intelligence could only proceed so far as his own sort of clinging to himself, right? His vanity, his desire to sort of preserve himself. But at the same time, this inability really to think of himself in a different sort of vanity as attractive or unattractive, ugly, and so on. So this person, in short, was just at once similar in certain ways and very different in others. So this state of nature is nowhere near as unequal, Rousseau concludes, as other philosophers have thought to be the case. And what's the relevance of this? Well, isn't it true that some people think we need government? They think we need society in order to protect ourselves, in order to protect the weak, in order to protect the strong from overexerting their strength and hurting other people. This, of course, is what Hobbes believed. This is why Hobbes thought we needed to come up with a contract with one another to sort of lay down our right to carry out the war of all against all, to leave that horrible, awful state. Well, for Rousseau, it is habit and sort of different ways of living that actually make up for a lot of the differences between humans. And Rousseau says these habits and these ways of living, they're not natural, right? They're in fact the opposite. They're cultural. They're societal. In the state of nature, you don't have these differences. So it's society then. Society that brings these things about, that's actually making us unequal. And this is going to be the whole argument of the second part of the book. Rousseau talks a little bit about temperament, but also you have education. And he says the latter is at least undeniably, right, without question, one of the big driving forces of inequality on the world today. People who can and people who cannot pursue an education which, at least in a vocational sense, right, the degree that you have might be necessary for any number of jobs. So isn't it true that he is onto something here? At the end of this first part of the book, Rousseau turns to a quick discussion of the idea of oppression and slavery. Rousseau says even these things only happen in the state that comes from or follows after the state of nature. Once you have society and culture and government, he says, you wouldn't have had any of these problems. You wouldn't have had oppression of people and enslavement of people in our natural state. He says, after all, it's impossible to enslave a man without first putting him in a situation where he cannot do without another man. So in the case even of the slave, right? I mean, the slave would need food and drink from his or her master in order to survive. Rousseau says if no one can put you in a situation where you rely on someone, where you're dependent upon someone, then you couldn't have had anyone be subject to enslavement. So one thing that follows from this, just in conclusion, is that an idea like the law of the strongest would have been vain in the state of nature. It wouldn't have been the case that you had this person at the top of a pyramid who was the strongest and could dominate or control everyone who was weaker, because this strongest person could never force these other people to rely on him, right? So it's just an utter impossibility, Rousseau thinks. So in the second part of the book, we'll turn to the specific steps throughout time and history that Rousseau thinks have resulted in our ever-increasing inequality.